Her scream tore through the dusk like a prayer swallowed by thunder. Birds fled from the trees, wings scattering into the dying light, as if the world itself was running from her pain. The desert wind caught her voice and carried it across the empty fields until it faded into the breath of the evening. Emma Darnell was running. Her bare feet struck the ground in desperate rhythm, skin torn, dress ripped, breath burning her chest like fire. Behind her, the forest groaned with the sound of hooves and men shouting, the smell of smoke and blood following close like a curse. In her trembling hands she clutched a wooden crate, heavy, splintered, its edges biting into her skin. She didn't even know why she'd taken it, only that something in her soul had whispered, "Hold on, don't let go. This is all you have left." The world around her blurred. The golden light of sunset turned to ash as night crawled in from the horizon. She stumbled, fell, rose again, her breath ragged. Somewhere behind her came a gunshot. The sound sliced through the air like the end of hope. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her tears mixed with dust, her heart echoing only one name. Wade. The man she loved. The man they killed. Every step was a goodbye she wasn't ready to say. The trees broke suddenly into open land. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in bruised shades of purple and gold. Before her, on the edge of the prairie, stood a lonely ranch. Smoke rose from a small forge beside the barn. The clang of iron against iron marked the rhythm of a man's life lived in silence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a shadow against the setting sun. His name was Luke Ramsey. And in that moment he turned, hammer paused mid-air, as the sound of her fall echoed through the yard. She collapsed just inside the fence, face down in the dirt, arms still wrapped around the crate. For a moment Luke thought she was a ghost, something the wind had dragged out of memory. Then he saw the blood. The way her fingers trembled, the way her lips moved soundlessly, as if begging heaven to wait. He dropped the tongs, crossed the yard in 3 strides, and knelt beside her. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her eyes wide but fading. "Emma?" he breathed before he even realized he'd said it. He knew her, had known her once, years ago, when her laughter could light a whole saloon. Now, that same woman was broken before him, her voice no louder than a dying ember. "They killed him," she whispered. "They're coming." And then she fell silent. Luke caught her before her body hit the earth. She felt weightless, fragile, like she might vanish if he let go. The smell of blood filled the air, sharp and metallic, mixing with the scent of the forge fire. He carried her inside, past the glowing embers, past the rifle hanging above the door, and laid her on the wooden bench near the hearth. Her pulse flickered faintly against his fingers, proof she still belonged to this world. "Stay with me," he murmured, pouring whiskey over a rag and pressing it to her side. She flinched hard, gasping in pain. "Easy now. You're safe." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he worked. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, and in the distance, the faint echo of hooves whispered through the hills. He felt it before he heard it, the storm coming, not from the sky, but from men who carried fire in their hearts. Emma stirred, her voice raw. "Luke, the gold. They think Wade hid it. But there was never any gold." Her words fell apart into sobs. "He just wanted us to dream." Luke said nothing. He only looked at her. The woman who had once danced in spring rain, now bleeding on his floor. The crate lay beside her, heavy with secrets. He brushed the dirt from its lid. It was locked, nailed shut, carved with old initials that looked like prayers in wood. "What's in it?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I don't know. I just grabbed it when they... She couldn't finish. Her voice broke into silence. Luke rose and crossed to the window. Beyond the fence, the world was turning black. The wind picked up again, carrying the smell of rain and iron. Somewhere in the dark, a horse cried out. He turned back to Emma. "They'll come for you." Her eyes widened, fear flickering like a candle in a storm. "He's with them," she whispered. "The one with the broken nose. He worked for us once. He knows this land. He knows where I live." Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen men like that before. In the war, in the mines, in the kind of nights you don't tell anyone about. He walked to the cabinet, took down his rifle, checked the chamber, and leaned it against the wall. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't forget where he is now." The fire cracked. The forge hissed. Emma's breathing slowed. For the first time in hours, her body began to relax. Luke watched her, the light from the flames drawing warmth back into her skin. There was something in her face, a strange peace that came only to the broken, a fragile kind of healing that whispered, "Maybe I'll live." He sat beside her through the night, the wind whispering through the eaves like a hymn. His thoughts wandered to the days before silence had settled in his heart, the war, the loss, the long years of working the land just to keep from thinking. And now, as he watched this woman sleep, he felt something stir in him, small and dangerous. A reason to care again. Outside, the moon rose over the hills, pale and cold. The shadows of the barn stretched long across the yard, and in the far distance, the faint echo of thunder rolled, a warning carried on the wind. Luke's gaze drifted back to the crate, its rough edges catching the firelight. What secret did it hold that men would kill for it? He reached out, ran his hand along its lid, and felt a faint pulse through the wood, as if the box itself was alive, breathing with the same rhythm as the storm outside. Emma murmured something in her sleep. He leaned closer, but caught only fragments. "Don't take it." "The gold. Wade, please." He swallowed hard. The pain in her voice reached something in him that hadn't moved in years. He stood, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and stared at the door. The night beyond it was alive with wind and danger, but there was a strange calm inside the room, the kind that makes a man believe that even the darkest night has a dawn. He looked back at her one last time before turning down the lamp. The flames dimmed to a soft glow, and the room filled with the sound of her breathing, uneven but real. For now, that was enough. And somewhere in the stillness, between the sigh of the fire and the whisper of her name, the world began to change. It was subtle, like the first light before sunrise, or the first breath after grief. The kind of change that doesn't shout, but heals. If you've ever known what it's like to run from something you couldn't fight, or to hold on to hope even when it hurts, then stay a while. Listen close. Maybe this story will remind you that no wound lasts forever, that sometimes love hides in the quiet places, waiting for you to believe again. And if these words find you in the soft hours of the night, let them keep you company. Tap that little heart, leave a kind word below, and subscribe if you wish to walk further down this dusty road. Because where Emma's footsteps fade, the real story is just beginning, one of danger, mercy, and the healing fire that burns quietly inside us all. The morning broke slow and gold, spilling through the cracks in the cabin walls like forgiveness. Luke Ramsey had barely slept. He sat by the dying fire, boots resting near the ash, watching the woman breathe. Emma's face, pale beneath the faint light, looked softer now, less like a survivor, more like someone drifting between the world of pain and the quiet place that waits beyond it. He'd cleaned her wound, stitched the gash near her ribs as carefully as he could with an old needle and a soldier's steadiness. The whiskey bottle lay half empty on the table. His hands still smelled of smoke, leather, and her blood. Outside, the wind had changed. The storm that had growled all night was retreating to the far ridges. The air carried that strange, clean scent that comes only after violence, the kind that makes a man remember there's still peace left somewhere, if he's willing to reach for it. Luke rose, poured the last of the coffee into a tin cup, and stepped to the window. The valley below glistened under the pale sun, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was waiting just beyond sight. Behind him, Emma stirred. Her voice was weak but real. Where am I?" "My ranch," he said quietly, turning toward her. "Broken Mesa." Her brow furrowed. "You shouldn't have helped me." He didn't answer right away. He set the cup down beside her, steam curling into the cold air. "Would have been wrong not to." She tried to sit up, but winced, pressing a hand to her side. "They'll come for me," she said. "For that crate." Luke's gaze drifted to the box sitting near the hearth. The firelight glinted off its rusted lock. "What's in it?" "I don't know." Her voice cracked, almost a whisper. "I grabbed it when everything went to hell. Wade said it was important once, but I never saw what was inside. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's the reason he died." Luke took a slow breath. The mention of Wade's name hung between them like dust in sunlight. He remembered the man, good with a joke, proud of his land, always chasing dreams bigger than his hands could hold. Luke had fought beside men like that. Men who thought hope alone could beat hunger. He looked back at Emma, saw the tremor in her jaw, the grief pressing behind her eyes. "You should rest," he said gently. "The bleeding stopped, but your body's still fighting." Her lips trembled. "You think they'll find me?" He shrugged, eyes cold. "If they do, they'll find something they didn't expect." Her gaze softened on him then, studying his face. "You were a soldier, weren't you?" He nodded once, the movement slow. "A long time ago." "What made you stay here?" Luke looked to the fire. The wood cracked like an old secret breaking. "Some men stay because they're tired of running, some because they don't know where else to go. Maybe both." Silence fell, thick but not heavy, the kind that carries the scent of healing, the first breath after sorrow, the first light after storm. Emma leaned back, closing her eyes. For a moment, she let herself feel safe, even if it was only borrowed safety. Luke watched her, arms crossed, jaw tight. He told himself it was duty that kept him there. But the truth ran deeper. Something about her, the way she held pain like a promise, the way she tried to hide the shaking in her hands, stirred the part of him that had forgotten what tenderness felt like. Hours passed. He stepped outside to chop wood, needing motion, needing to think. The sun rose higher, burning away the mist. From the ridge he could see the road that led toward town. Empty for now, but emptiness never lasted long out here. He swung the axe again, hard, the rhythm steady and sharp. Sweat glistened on his arms, dust clinging to his shirt. Each strike was a release, each breath a prayer. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Emma stood there, wrapped in a blanket, hair tangled, cheeks still pale but alive. "You shouldn't be out here," he said without turning. "I needed air." She stepped closer, her bare feet brushing the dirt. "You really think you can stop them if they come?" Luke rested the axe against the stump. "I can slow them down." Her eyes followed the horizon, wide and haunted. "They won't stop, Luke. They think I know where it is. The gold." He looked at her, sunlight cutting across his scarred face. "Do you?" She met his gaze. "No. But they'll never believe that." The wind lifted her hair, brushed the dust from her lashes. For a heartbeat the world felt still. Then, from far off, came the faint echo of laughter. Men's laughter, the kind that curdles the blood. Emma stiffened. Luke turned toward the sound, every muscle alert. But the sound faded as quickly as it came, swallowed by distance. "Inside," he said quietly. She obeyed, and he followed. By midday, the ranch had settled into uneasy quiet. Luke checked his rifles, cleaned the barrels, and loaded the cartridges one by one. Emma sat near the table, watching him with a mixture of fear and awe. The air between them held something fragile, almost holy, a quiet understanding that survival sometimes looks like love before it dares to call itself that. She spoke softly. "You could send me away. You don't have to risk yourself." Luke's voice was calm but sure. "There's nowhere safe to send you." Her throat tightened. "Why help me then?" He paused, running a rag along the steel barrel. "Because you needed someone who wouldn't run." Her eyes filled, not with tears, but with something deeper. A recognition that this man, this quiet stranger, was the kind of strength that didn't need to shout. Afternoon light filled the room. Dust floated through the beams like small ghosts. Emma's hand rested unconsciously on the crate. Her fingers traced the carved initials, and she whispered, "W.D." "Wade Darnell," Luke said softly. She nodded. "He believed the land could love us back. I used to believe it too." Luke looked at her, then at the open door where the light spilled in. "Maybe it still can." Her lips parted as if to answer, but the words never came. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that heals. When night came again, the valley glowed with the last embers of sunset. Luke stood outside, leaning against the porch post, eyes on the horizon. The same wind that had carried Emma's screams now carried the scent of rain and distant gunpowder. He could feel the weight of what was coming. He'd felt it before, the moment before battle, the stillness before the world breaks again. Inside, Emma sat by the fire, brushing her hair with a wooden comb she found on the shelf. Each stroke was slow, deliberate, like she was trying to remember how to be human again. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the window, the ghost of a woman learning how to breathe after loss. Luke turned, saw her there, and something inside him softened. The loneliness that had lived in his bones began to ease, replaced by something gentler. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Storm's coming," he said. She smiled faintly. I know. The wind moaned around the cabin. The lamps flickered. Outside, the world held its breath. Luke moved to the mantel, took down an old revolver and placed it on the table beside her. "If they find this place," he said, "don't hesitate." Her fingers brushed the cold metal. "I've never shot a man." He met her eyes. "Then pray you never have to." The flames threw their shadows on the walls, long and trembling. Emma reached out and touched his hand, just lightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not leaving me out there." His hand closed around hers, rough against soft skin. "You don't thank someone for doing what's right," he said. "You just keep breathing." Something in her broke quietly, not into sorrow, but into release. The warmth of his touch spread through her like a healing current. For the first time since Wade's death, she let herself breathe without shaking. The night stretched on. Luke kept watch by the window, rifle across his knees, eyes sharp but heart slower now, heavier in a different way. The stars flickered through gaps in the clouds, and the forge outside burned low, casting a dull red glow across the yard. Emma lay near the fire, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of smoke and safety. Her heartbeat, slow and steady, filled the space between them. The sound soothed him more than he would ever admit. In the quiet, something unspoken grew. A promise, soft as dawn, strong as faith. It hummed through the wooden walls, through the heartbeat of the night, through the souls of two people who didn't yet know they were saving each other. The wind outside shifted again, colder this time. Luke glanced toward the dark horizon and saw far away the faint shimmer of lanterns moving through the trees. He didn't wake her. Not yet. Let her have this peace for a little longer. The world would come for them soon enough. He reached for the rifle, thumbed the safety, and whispered into the firelight, "Not tonight." And as the night deepened, the ranch breathed with them. Old wood creaking, fire sighing, hearts learning how to trust again in the fragile, healing warmth of silence. The danger was near, but so was something else, something rarer than gold. The beginning of love. The night had passed with its teeth bared, but dawn came soft and forgiving. A pale light brushed the hills, melting the frost clinging to the grass, and the world felt momentarily new. Luke Ramsey stood on the porch with his rifle across his arm, eyes on the horizon. His breath made small ghosts in the morning chill. Somewhere far away, a hawk circled lazily above the ridge. It was quiet. Too quiet, and in that stillness lay a truth he couldn't ignore. Peace was just the breath before another storm. Inside, Emma was awake. She sat by the table, wrapped in a wool blanket, a cup of coffee trembling in her hands. Her skin looked fragile against the rising light, her hair undone, her lips pale but alive. She watched Luke from the window, the way he moved like a man who had seen too much war to ever stand completely still again. He wasn't just guarding the ranch, he was guarding what little hope she had left. She tried to steady her breathing. The dream from the night before still clung to her, a nightmare painted with her husband's face, with the echo of boots and laughter and Wade's voice shouting her name. She pressed her palms against the table until her knuckles whitened. When Luke came back inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, he looked at her and said nothing. He didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between them now, born in blood and silence. He set his rifle down near the door, took a slow sip from his own cup, and leaned against the wall. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. "Didn't want to," he replied. She nodded. "You think they'll come back?" He looked out the window again, the light catching the scar that ran along his jaw. "Men like that don't quit, not when they think there's something worth killing for." Emma's fingers tightened around the cup. "They won't believe me when I tell them there's no gold." "They don't need to believe you," Luke said, his tone calm but heavy. "They just need to want." The word hung in the air. Want. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about pride, revenge, the sickness that grew in men when greed mixed with fear. Emma swallowed hard, staring at the crate by the fire. "What if they're right?" He frowned. "Right about what?" "What if there is something in there? Something Wade found?" He was secretive toward the end, stayed up late in the barn, whispering to himself. Her voice trembled. "Maybe I never really knew him." Luke's gaze softened. "You loved him. That's knowing enough." Her throat tightened. "He was a good man once." "But dreams make fools of good men." Luke stepped closer. "So do lies." She met his eyes. There was no judgment in his voice, just a quiet truth. He had seen it all before, the way hope could turn to hunger, how love could sour under the weight of need. A gust of wind pushed against the cabin walls, rattling the window panes. The sky was turning grey, the air thick with something unspoken. Emma shivered, though the fire was still burning. Luke noticed and reached for the spare coat hanging by the door. He draped it over her shoulders, his hands brushing lightly against her neck. The warmth of that simple touch broke something open inside her, something small and human that had been buried under fear. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, his eyes holding hers for a heartbeat too long before he turned away. "You should eat something." But she wasn't hungry, not for food anyway. There was a deeper hunger now, the kind that comes when safety starts to feel like tenderness. And hours passed in uneasy calm. Luke worked outside, hammering new boards on the fence, keeping his hands busy while his mind circled the same thought. How long before they find her? Emma stayed near the fire, staring at the crate, lost in the quiet storm of her own thoughts. By afternoon, the air shifted again. The birds that had returned at dawn vanished into the trees. The horses grew restless in the corral, stamping and snorting. Luke felt it first, a vibration in the ground, faint but real. He turned toward the ridge and saw dust rising, small at first, then spreading like smoke. "They're coming," he said under his breath. He strode into the cabin. Emma looked up, her face draining of color. "You saw them?" 3, maybe 4. Armed. Her heartbeat quickened. "What do we do?" Luke didn't hesitate. "We make them believe they found what they came for." She stared at him, confused. "How?" He moved to the hearth, knelt beside the crate, and examined the lock. "You said you don't know what's in here. That's good. Neither will they." He pried at the corner, then stopped. "You trust me, Emma?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I do." He nodded once. "Then do exactly what I say." They worked fast. Luke dragged an old barrel from the barn, moved the rug aside, and pulled up the wooden hatch beneath the floorboards, a hidden space deep enough for 2. "Back in the war," he said quietly. We used these to outlast the Rebs. Now it's your turn." Emma looked down into the dark. "What about you?" "I'll be here." His tone was final. "No," she said, stepping closer. "You can't face them alone." His eyes met hers, steady and calm. "Someone has to buy you time." She wanted to argue, but something in his face stopped her. It wasn't pride or recklessness. It was a kind of peace. The peace of a man who had already made his decision long before the danger came. He helped her down into the hiding place, his hands steady even as hers shook. The darkness swallowed her, and she heard the rug fall back into place above. For a moment she could see nothing, only the muffled sound of his boots pacing across the floor. Then silence. Minutes passed like hours. The only sound was her heartbeat and the wind scratching against the walls. She pressed her hand against the dirt, trying to calm her breath. "He'll be all right," she told herself. "He has to be." Then footsteps, more than one. Heavy, deliberate. Voices outside, rough and mocking. The door creaked open. "Evening, old man," a voice drawled. "We're looking for a lady. Came through here last night. Pretty thing, bleeding bad, carrying something that don't belong to her." Luke's voice answered, steady as stone. "She's not here." "Funny," another man said. "Her blood trail says otherwise." Emma bit her lip hard, her whole body trembling. "Well," Luke replied, "you better make sure it's her blood before you go following it." Laughter. Cruel, sharp. Then silence. The air grew thick. A single gunshot shattered the quiet. Emma clapped her hands over her ears. The ground shook. Another shot. Then the crash of breaking glass, the roar of the forge outside, shouting. The world above her turned into chaos, the heavy rhythm of boots, the sound of men falling, the hiss of hot iron meeting blood. She squeezed her eyes shut and prayed. When the noise finally stopped, the silence that followed was unbearable. The air reeked of smoke and gunpowder. Then she heard his voice, low and hoarse, through the cracks in the floor. "It's done." The hatch opened. Luke's face appeared in the flickering light, smeared with soot and sweat, eyes burning like coals. He reached down, offering his hand. She climbed out slowly, her knees weak. The room was filled with smoke, the bodies of two men sprawled across the floorboards, their faces hidden in shadow. Emma stared, trembling. "Are they—" He nodded. "All but one." She swallowed hard, her eyes wide. "Where is he?" Luke's gaze flicked toward the door. "Outside. He's got answers I need." The night air hit her like a slap, cold and thick with the smell of rain and blood. Near the fence, a man lay gasping, his shirt soaked crimson. Luke crouched beside him, voice low and steady. "Why Wade? Why kill him?" The man coughed, spitting red. "He owed us," he rasped. "No," Luke said quietly. "You owed him." The dying man's eyes darted toward the barn. He tried to speak, but only one word escaped. "Gold." Then he went still. Emma's breath caught. She looked at Luke, confusion and dread twisting together. He said, "I heard," Luke murmured. He stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. His eyes turned toward the barn. "We're not done yet." The wind rose, carrying the first drops of rain. The forge hissed, its flame shrinking in the wet. Together they walked toward the barn, hearts pounding in the rhythm of the storm. The big doors creaked open under Luke's hand. The lantern light spilled into the dark, touching hay, tools, and old wood. Nothing moved. He kicked at the ground. Hollow. He dropped to one knee, brushed the dirt aside, and uncovered a trap-door. Beneath it, an old chest. When he lifted the lid, gold coins glimmered in the lantern glow. Real. Cold. Heavy. Emma's hand flew to her mouth. He wasn't lying. Her voice broke into a sob. He really found it. Luke said nothing. He only watched her, watched the tears slip down her face, like the last remnants of a dream. She sank to her knees beside the chest, fingers trembling over the coins. He died for this. Luke's voice was soft but unyielding. And maybe we'll live because of it. Thunder rumbled over the hills. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. It drummed against the roof, washing the blood from the dirt, cleansing the air. Emma leaned her head against the wood of the chest, breathing deeply. The storm outside matched the one inside her, wild, painful, but strangely healing. Luke stood beside her, the lantern light painting warmth across their faces. For the first time since this nightmare began, their eyes met without fear. Outside, the hooves of another rider echoed through the rain. Neither of them moved. The story wasn't finished. But for one fragile moment, surrounded by gold, fire, and rain, they both felt something rare, an unspoken peace that whispered, "We survived." The healing had only just begun. Rain fell through the night like a blessing the earth had been waiting for. It ran down the roof in silver streams, whispering against the windows, softening the world that had been too sharp for too long. Inside the barn, the golden coins still shimmered faintly in the lantern light, but the fire between them had changed. It wasn't just the glow of discovery. It was the quiet breath of two hearts, realizing that survival had bound them tighter than fear ever could. Emma sat near the chest, her palms open, catching the raindrops that slipped through the broken slats of the roof. The water streaked her cheeks, mixing with the tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She wasn't crying for Wade anymore, not entirely. She was crying for everything. The pain, the running, the sleepless nights, and now the unbearable peace that felt almost too kind. Luke watched her from where he stood, hands braced on his knees, the rain darkening his hair, tracing the edge of his jaw. He'd seen grief before, raw, loud, and angry, but this was different. There was something healing in her silence, something sacred in the way she let herself break softly instead of shatter. He took a slow step toward her. "Emma." His voice was low, almost a murmur swallowed by the rain. She looked up. The lamplight caught in her eyes like the last flame refusing to die. "He wanted this for us," she whispered. "He said we'd go west, find land, start again." "I thought he was just dreaming." Her fingers brushed over the coins. "Now that I see it's real, it feels wrong." Luke crouched beside her, his voice steady. "It's not the gold that's wrong. It's what it cost." She let out a trembling laugh. "Everything has a cost." "Not everything." His gaze lingered on her face, on the faint tremor in her lips. "Some things are just given when you've got nothing left to lose." For a heartbeat, neither moved. The rain filled the silence between them, a rhythm as old as the land itself. Then thunder rolled far across the hills, and both turned toward the sound. A horse's cry echoed through the night, closer this time, real. Emma stiffened. Luke rose, scanning the darkness. The shape appeared at the edge of the fence, a lone rider wrapped in a long coat, the brim of his hat dripping with rain. He didn't draw his weapon. He lifted one hand slowly in greeting. Luke's rifle was already in his hands, the motion automatic, instinct born of too many nights like this. "Stay here," he murmured. He stepped out into the rain. The cold soaked through his shirt, but he barely felt it. The stranger stopped just short of the barn, his boots sinking into the wet earth. Lightning flashed, and Luke saw the badge glint on his chest. "Name's McCready," the man said. "Sheriff from town." Luke didn't lower the rifle yet. "Long ride for a night like this." "Longer if I'd come any later," McCready replied. His voice was calm, but carried the kind of weight that made a man listen. "Heard gunfire. Thought I'd find trouble." "You found it," Luke said, nodding toward the bodies near the fence. The sheriff's eyes moved from one shape to another, then to the open barn door and the faint glow inside. He saw Emma, pale and still, the lantern light painting her like a ghost. His jaw tightened. "You want to tell me what happened?" Luke sighed. "They came for her. They killed her husband before. Tried to finish the job here." McCready stepped closer, lowering his hat. "And you?" "I finished it for them." The sheriff's eyes softened. "I reckon that's justice enough." He looked past Luke to the open chest of gold, and his voice dropped. So it was true. Emma rose then, stepping into the rain, her blanket trailing behind her like the tail of a forgotten dream. "He didn't steal it," she said. "It was his claim. He found it fair." McCready studied her a long moment. "I don't doubt it, ma'am, but gold draws more ghosts than the graveyard." Luke's shoulders eased. The man wasn't here to take anything from them. He could tell from his tone. He was tired of death, too. The sheriff adjusted his reins. "Bury them come morning," he said quietly, "and bury that gold deeper. Folks'll kill for less out here." He tipped his hat to Emma, then to Luke, and turned his horse toward the dark horizon. The rain swallowed him whole, his silhouette fading into the storm like a story already ending. When he was gone, the ranch felt empty again, but not the same kind of empty as before. This was quieter, cleaner, a space left open for something new. Luke turned back to Emma, who stood still under the rain, her face lifted toward the sky. "You should come inside," he said softly. "You'll catch cold." She smiled faintly. "Maybe the rain's the only thing that's real anymore." He didn't argue. He walked to her instead, took her hand, and guided her back inside. Her fingers were cold but steady in his, and he could feel her pulse, a small, stubborn rhythm, reminding him that life kept going, no matter how much it hurt. Inside, the fire had burned low. Luke fed it another log, watching the sparks rise like tiny stars. Emma sank into the chair by the hearth, pulling the blanket around her shoulders again. The warmth touched her face, and her eyes softened. "I don't want the gold," she said after a while. "Not a single coin. I just want peace." Luke looked at her, the firelight flickering across his eyes. "Peace is harder to find than gold," he said quietly, "but sometimes it shows up when you stop looking." She leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes. "You sound like a preacher." He smiled faintly. "No, ma'am. Just a man who's lost enough to know what matters." For a long time, neither spoke. The rain slowed, turning to mist. The scent of wet earth drifted through the cracks in the walls. Luke's mind wandered, back to the years of war, the faces he'd buried, the nights he thought he'd never wake from. But this moment, this quiet cabin with a broken woman finding her way back to life, felt like a prayer answered in silence. He poured them each a small drink of whiskey, handed her the cup. "To Wade," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. "To Wade, and to the living." Their cups clinked softly. The warmth spread through them like fire and forgiveness all at once. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of cedar and damp grass. Somewhere, a coyote called. A lonely sound, but not hopeless. Luke glanced toward the window. The clouds were parting, stars bleeding through like shy confessions. Emma followed his gaze. "Do you ever get tired of being alone?" His answer came slow. "Every damn day." She smiled, tired, genuine, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for promises. "Then maybe don't be." He looked at her, the flicker of the fire catching the gold in her eyes. Something in his chest eased, a knot he hadn't realized he'd carried for years. He didn't reach for her, not yet, but he didn't turn away either. They sat together until the fire burned down to embers, until the rain stopped whispering and the first birds began to stir outside. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind the scent of wet wood, smoke, and something softer. Hope, maybe. By the time dawn returned, the land was quiet again. They buried the men near the ridge and Wade on the hill overlooking the valley, where the sun touched the stones first each morning. Emma's tears fell onto the fresh earth like rain returning to the river it came from. Luke stood beside her, silent, hat pressed to his chest. When it was done, she looked at him and whispered, "You saved my life." He shook his head. "Maybe, but you reminded me it's still worth living." The words hung between them, gentle as sunlight through the clouds. They walked back down the hill side by side, neither speaking, their hands brushing once, twice, then finding each other naturally, like two rivers meeting. The wind moved through the grass, soft and healing. The pain didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. The ghosts faded a little, and somewhere inside the ache, a new beginning quietly bloomed. The land, once soaked in blood, now smelled of rain and forgiveness. The forge would burn again, the fences would stand, and in the hush of the coming days, maybe, just maybe, love would take root in the ashes of what was lost. The world was still harsh, but not unkind. And for the first time in a long while, Luke Ramsey felt that maybe, in this quiet place beneath the endless western sky, he'd found the one thing he thought he'd buried forever: home. The days that followed passed slowly, like the land itself was teaching them how to breathe again. The storm had left behind puddles that shimmered under the sun, fields heavy with the scent of wet earth and sage. The hills looked softer now, washed clean of dust and grief. Luke spent the mornings mending fences, his shirt damp with sweat and dew, the hammer striking a rhythm that sounded almost like peace. Emma would watch from the porch, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, the wind teasing her hair as if reminding her she was still alive. Each dawn began quietly, the kind of quiet that heals more than words ever could. Sometimes she would step barefoot into the yard, the grass cool beneath her feet, and Luke would glance up from his work. Their eyes would meet, and neither would speak, because silence had learned to say everything. At night they would sit by the fire, talking in fragments, the way people do when they're learning to trust their voices again. She told him stories of Wade, not the tragedy, but the little pieces of him that were good. How he carved birds out of driftwood, how he sang off key just to make her laugh. Luke listened without jealousy, his hands wrapped around his cup, eyes fixed on the flame. "He loved you," Luke said one night, his voice low, certain. Emma smiled faintly. "He did, but I think he loved the dream of us even more. Maybe that's what killed him." Luke's gaze softened. Dreams don't kill people. Greed does. Lies do. But the dream itself, it keeps us alive long enough to find the truth. Her eyes shimmered in the glow of the fire. "You talk like a man who's seen too many endings." "I've seen enough to know they're not always the end." The room fell silent again, filled only by the crackle of firewood and the wind whispering at the cracks in the door. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, and in the rhythm of the flames she heard something she hadn't felt in a long time. Safety, not the fragile kind that hides, but the kind that stays. The next morning, Luke saddled his horse and rode to town. He told her to lock the door and keep the rifle near. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew word about the gold would spread. And men, desperate men, had a way of hearing whispers even the wind tried to hide. The town was small, a few stores, a saloon, the sheriff's office. Macready was sitting on the porch when Luke arrived, pipe between his teeth. The man looked up, nodding once. "Didn't figure I'd see you so soon." Luke dismounted. "Didn't figure I'd have to come back." The sheriff studied him quietly. "Word's moving fast. Couple drifters claim there's gold out by Broken Mesa." Luke's eyes hardened. "There's nothing left worth dying over." "Maybe you believe that," Macready said, "but the kind of men who come for gold don't." He took a long drag from his pipe, the smoke curling around his hat brim. "You keep her safe. There'll be more coming. Not tonight, maybe, but soon." Luke nodded once. He didn't promise anything. Promises were for men who could afford to fail. When he returned that evening, the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in colors that felt almost holy. Emma was waiting by the gate, her hands folded together, the golden light catching in her hair. For a moment, she looked like a memory too beautiful to touch. "You went to town," she said, worry shadowing her face. He nodded. "Sheriff's keeping an eye out." "But word's spreading." She stepped closer, searching his eyes. "So we're not safe?" "No," he said softly. "Not yet." Her breath trembled. "Then what do we do?" Luke looked toward the barn. The gold was still there, buried again beneath the trapdoor, under layers of dirt and hay. "We hide what's left of the past," he said, "and hold on to the part that's worth keeping." They worked until dark, burying the chest deeper this time, beneath old boards and broken tools, the sweat on their skin mixed with dust and the scent of earth. When it was done, Emma knelt beside the spot, her hand resting on the ground as if sealing it with a prayer. "Let it stay here," she whispered. "Let it rest." Luke stood behind her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "It will," he said. "But if trouble comes again, we don't run this time." She looked up at him then, her eyes fierce through the tears. "You'd fight for me?" He didn't hesitate. "I already did." The words hung in the still air like a vow, heavy and tender all at once. She rose slowly, her hand brushing against his arm. You shouldn't have to fight alone." His lips curved into a small smile. "You won't let me anyway." That night they ate by the fire. The air was cool and sweet, the stars brighter than they'd been in weeks. Emma leaned her head against the wall, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. Luke sat across from her, oiling his rifle with deliberate care, though his eyes kept drifting back to her. The way she breathed, slow and calm now, the way her lips parted slightly when she looked into the flames. When she spoke again, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I used to think I'd never feel safe again." He looked at her. "Do you now?" Her gaze met his. "Yes, I don't know why, but when you're near, I do." The quiet stretched between them like a soft blanket. Luke set the rifle aside and moved closer to the fire. He didn't touch her, didn't need to. The space between them felt alive, humming with something that was neither fear nor desire, something older, gentler, the beginning of love growing in the cracks of grief. "You should rest," he said finally. "Only if you will." He smiled. "Deal." They slept near the fire that night, the glow painting their faces in gold and rose. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like a lullaby. Luke woke once before dawn, the sound of her breathing steady beside him. He watched her for a long while, her hand resting near his, the soft curve of her shoulder rising and falling with each breath. Something in him healed in that quiet moment. The soldier, the wanderer, the man who'd forgotten tenderness. When morning came, they worked side by side, repairing the barn door, clearing debris from the fence line. It felt good to build instead of destroy, to fix something instead of bury it. Emma laughed once, sudden and unguarded, and Luke turned sharply at the sound. He hadn't heard laughter like that in years. It rolled through him like sunlight through cold bones. "You should laugh more often," he said. Her cheeks flushed. "Maybe I just needed a reason." By evening the ranch looked alive again. Smoke rose from the chimney, the horses grazed near the stream, and the valley glowed beneath a copper sky. Luke sat on the porch steps, cleaning his hands, when Emma joined him with 2 cups of coffee. They sat in silence, watching the light fade. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but every time I do, the land reminds me it's not done with me yet." She nodded, tracing the rim of her cup. "Maybe it's not done with either of us." Their eyes met, and the warmth between them deepened, no longer uncertain, but calm, steady, real. As night fell, Luke rose to light the lantern. The glow reached the edges of the yard, pushing back the darkness bit by bit. He turned back to her, his voice soft. "You don't have to keep running anymore." She smiled, tears glistening like stars in her eyes. "Then maybe I'll learn to stay." The wind carried the scent of rain again, faint but familiar, like a memory coming home. The land around them was still raw, still wild, but it was no longer cruel. It was simply alive, like them. And somewhere in the gentle rhythm of crickets and firelight, in the healing pulse of the earth itself, 2 hearts began to beat in the same quiet time. Not as strangers, not as ghosts of what they'd lost, but as 2 souls, bruised and breathing, who had found the courage to begin again. The night deepened, the stars leaned closer, and the ranch, once a place of death, became something else entirely, a sanctuary, a promise, a home reborn under the whispering sky. The moon rose full and pale over Broken Mesa, silvering the wet grass and throwing long shadows across the quiet ranch. The forge was dark now, the fires long gone cold, but the warmth still lingered in the air, an invisible trace of all the nights they had survived together. Luke Ramsey leaned against the porch rail, watching the horizon with eyes that had learned to read danger like scripture. Yet tonight, for the first time, he saw no movement in the valley, only the flicker of lightning far away and the slow drift of clouds that looked like smoke from another life. Inside, Emma was humming softly, the sound fragile and warm, like the hush between raindrops. She had begun to sing again, quietly at first, to herself, when she thought he wasn't listening. The melody was old, something her mother had taught her, and though her voice trembled, it carried through the house like prayer. It made the place feel alive. The cabin had changed. What was once a shelter for hiding had become a home slowly learning how to breathe again. She stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet brushing against the wooden floor. Her hair was still damp from washing, the curls clinging to her shoulders. Luke turned at the sound of her steps. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't need words to reach him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "Never could when the wind sounds like this." She tilted her face toward the open land, the night air cool against her skin. "It's different now. Before, every gust felt like it was chasing me. Now it just feels alive." Luke's voice was low. "Maybe it's because you stopped running." Her gaze met his. "Maybe it's because I found something worth staying for." The words slipped between them, simple, unplanned, and real. The night seemed to pause. He didn't move, didn't even breathe for a moment. The wind sighed through the valley, and in that sound was every word they hadn't dared to speak. He reached out, brushed a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His touch was careful, reverent, as if afraid she might vanish again like a ghost. "You're safe here," he murmured. "I know," she whispered, "because you are." They stood like that for a long while, just the two of them and the endless night. The world beyond the fence could wait. There was no gold worth chasing now, no past worth resurrecting. Only this fragile peace they had carved out of blood and ashes. When the wind grew colder, Luke stepped back inside to stoke the fire. The glow spread across the walls, turning the room golden and soft. Emma followed, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She sat near the hearth, watching the flames lick at the wood, and he watched her. How the light played against her skin, how her eyes caught the fire and held it. She spoke quietly, as though afraid to disturb the air between them. "I buried the locket this morning," she said. "The one Wade gave me. It felt wrong to keep wearing it." Luke's hands paused over the kindling. "You didn't have to." "I did," she replied. "He was my past. But this—" She gestured around them, to the small cabin, to the warmth, to the quiet. "This feels like the rest of my life." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to men who never thought they'd smile again. "You've got a way of making hard things sound simple." Emma laughed softly. "You make them simple, Luke. I just listen." He didn't know how to answer that, so he let the silence do it for him. He poured them both coffee instead of whiskey, and they drank in comfortable quiet, listening to the storm fade into the distance. By dawn, The sky had turned lavender, soft and endless. Luke saddled his horse while Emma packed bread and dried meat into a basket. He was heading into town again for supplies, though neither of them said aloud what they both knew, that danger always circles back. Still, life doesn't stop waiting for peace to be permanent. It just moves with it. "Be careful," she said, as he tightened the reins. He looked down at her, one hand on the saddle horn. "Always am." "That's not what I mean," she said. "Be careful with your heart, too." Her words hit him deeper than he expected. He wanted to tell her that his heart wasn't the same anymore, that somewhere between her tears and her laughter she had rebuilt what the war and loneliness had broken. But instead he just nodded. "You too." He rode off through the morning mist, the sun climbing behind the hills, and she watched until the dust faded. The sound of hooves faded into the wind, leaving her alone on the porch, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt rooted. The land no longer looked empty. It looked like it was holding her up. The day stretched long and quiet. Emma worked in the garden behind the cabin, pulling weeds and tending the small shoots of corn Wade had planted months before. Her hands were steady now. Each time she touched the earth, she felt its pulse beneath her fingers, steady and alive, the same rhythm that now beat quietly in her chest. Healing, she thought, wasn't a thing that happened all at once. It was something you did every morning, one breath, one seed, one sunrise at a time. As the sun began to dip, she saw movement at the far ridge, a dark figure approaching on horseback. Her heart skipped, then steadied when she recognized the shape. Luke. But there was someone else beside him, smaller, slumped slightly in the saddle. She ran to the gate as they drew closer. Luke dismounted, pulling another man down carefully, one of the miners from town, wounded but alive. "Bandits," Luke said quickly. "They hit the trading post. Sheriff's hurt, but breathing. This one took a bullet." Emma helped him carry the man inside, and her hands worked with calm urgency, cleaning the wound, heating water, stitching under Luke's watch. The smell of whiskey and blood filled the room again, but this time there was no fear in it, only purpose. She had been broken once, but not fragile. She had learned that strength doesn't always come with weapons. It comes with kindness that refuses to fade. When the man was stable, Luke leaned against the wall, exhaustion lining his face. Emma touched his arm. "You did good," she said softly. "You saved him." He shook his head. "Not sure how much saving a man like me's got left in him." She looked up at him, her eyes warm, sure. "Enough for me." The simplicity of her words sank deep. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing her jaw. The air between them shifted. There was no rush, no demand, only the steady pull of two souls finding their place. "I never thought peace would look like this," he whispered. She smiled, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. "Peace never looks how we imagine. It just shows up when we've stopped trying to deserve it." He leaned his forehead against hers. The world outside seemed to fall away. The hills, the storm, the past. All that remained was warmth, breath, and the quiet promise that maybe love could exist after ruin. Later, when the wounded man slept and the fire burned low, Luke sat by the window, rifle resting across his knees. Emma came up behind him, wrapping a shawl around his shoulders. "You should rest," she said. He looked at her, weary but content. "I am." She smiled, her hand resting on his. The moonlight touched her face, turning her hair silver, her eyes soft as dawn. "Tomorrow," she whispered, "we start again." He nodded, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of her voice settle into him. Outside, the wind moved gently through the grass, not as a warning this time, but as a lullaby. And somewhere between the heartbeat of the land and the quiet of the night, the ranch became what it was always meant to be, not a place of hiding, but of beginning. The ghosts were still there, buried under the hills, under the barn, under memory itself, but they no longer haunted. They simply rested. Luke's breathing slowed. Emma's hand stayed in his, their fingers interlaced, steady and sure. The world was vast, still untamed, still uncertain, but within these four walls was something steady and rare, a kind of love that didn't burn, it healed. The night deepened, wrapping the cabin in silence. Tomorrow would bring new work, new risks, maybe even new wounds. But for now, they had this: the warmth of the fire, the whisper of the wind, and the quiet grace of two hearts that had found their way home. The seasons began to turn quietly, as if the world was learning how to breathe again, right alongside them. Summer melted into early autumn, the air softer now, full of gold dust and the scent of wild sage. The hills around Broken Mesa glowed each evening with the same honey light that touched Emma's skin when she stood by the porch at sunset. The worst of the fear had passed, though neither of them spoke about it any more. The nights were calm. The horses grazed freely again. The earth had found its rhythm, and so had they. Luke had built a new fence by the stream, hands rough and scarred from the work, but steady. He liked the sound of the hammer striking wood. It reminded him that something could still be built in this world, something that might last. When he came back from the fields in the afternoons, Emma would be waiting with water, her hair braided loose, eyes calm. She had begun to smile without forcing it. The lines of exhaustion that had once cut across her face were fading like old scars. They lived simply. They mended what broke, planted what they could, and learned how to share silence as if it were language. There was no talk of gold now, only soil, seeds, and time. Each morning they woke to the sound of birds in the eaves, to the low groan of the wind through the barn, and to the comfort of knowing that healing doesn't always need to be spoken to be real. Luke had started carving again. Small things, handles, spoons, the shape of a dove he kept by the window. He said it gave his hands something to do when his mind went quiet. Emma often watched him, the knife glinting in the firelight, the curl of wood falling like soft feathers to the floor. She had learned that he didn't speak much, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd learned long ago that silence could carry more truth than words. Sometimes she would hum while she cooked, and the tune would slip through the cabin like sunlight through a dusty window. Luke never interrupted her. He just listened, his heart easing into the rhythm of it. It reminded him of the world before gunfire, before grief had carved its mark on his chest. One evening, as the sky turned red behind the hills, Luke sat sharpening a blade while Emma watched from the steps. The air was warm, touched with the sweetness of drying grass. He stopped for a moment, looking toward the horizon, where the light was sinking behind the ridge. "Tomorrow I'll ride into town," he said. "Sheriff's still short on men since the raid. Might be they need supplies. Emma nodded. "Do you trust the town again?" He thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Not the town, just the few good souls in it." "Then I'll bake you bread to take with you," she said softly. He looked at her, the corner of his mouth curving upward. "You already do more for me than any man deserves." Her voice caught slightly. "I'm just doing what keeps me breathing." Luke turned his eyes back to the horizon. "Then keep breathing here, with me." The words hung there, simple and heavy as the coming dusk. Emma didn't answer. She didn't have to. She reached out, touched his shoulder lightly, and in that small touch was every promise she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. The next day, when he left, the morning was clear. She watched him ride away down the trail, dust rising behind his horse. She stood there long after he'd vanished from sight, arms wrapped around herself, a quiet ache blooming under her ribs. The ranch felt too still without him, the air heavy, the hours slow. She worked through the day anyway, feeding the animals, sweeping the porch, humming under her breath to fill the silence he left behind. By sunset, the horizon began to blush again. She lit the lamp and set it near the window so he would see it from the road when he returned. The light flickered against the glass, steady and bright. Then she sat near the fire and waited. The night deepened. The wind rose, carrying the far-off call of a coyote. She tried not to worry, but something in her chest kept twisting tighter with each passing hour. When she finally heard the faint sound of hooves, she went to the door, heart thundering. The shape that appeared out of the darkness was familiar. The tilt of his hat, the straightness of his back. He dismounted slowly, the horse snorting in the cold air. He looked tired, but unharmed. She ran to meet him halfway, stopping just close enough to see his face in the lamplight. "You're late," she said, voice trembling with relief. "Ran into some drifters," he said. "Nothing worth trouble. Sheriff sends his regards." Emma reached out, her hand brushing the dust from his sleeve. "You worry me every time you leave." He smiled gently. "Then I'll stop leaving." They stood there a long while, the night wind brushing against their skin, the moon climbing higher above them. Luke reached out, took her hand, and together they walked back into the house. Inside, the warmth of the fire welcomed them. The glow made their shadows stretch long and soft against the walls. Emma poured him coffee, her hands still trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, steadying her without a word. "You're cold," he murmured. "Only until you came back." The simplicity of her answer hit something deep in him. He set the cup down, stepped closer, and touched her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw with the back of his hand. She closed her eyes at the warmth of his skin, leaning into it like it was sunlight. He kissed her then, softly, not as a claim, but as a question. Her hands found his chest, resting there for a moment before sliding up around his neck. The world seemed to narrow to that small space between them, the faint crackle of fire, the whisper of their breath, the shared heartbeat in the quiet. When they finally pulled apart, her eyes were bright with tears, though she was smiling. "I didn't think I'd ever be held again," she whispered. "You've been holding this place together since the day you walked in," he said. Her lips trembled into a laugh, half joy, half ache. "Maybe we've both been saving what was left of each other." He nodded. "Maybe that's what love really is." The night passed slowly, tenderly. They spoke little, moving through the small house as if afraid to wake the walls. Emma sat by the window while Luke fixed the fire, and every few moments their eyes would meet, quiet and sure. There was no grand declaration, no urgency, just the deep, certain warmth of two souls that had already chosen each other without needing to say it aloud. The next morning the sun rose soft and golden through the curtains. Luke was already outside feeding the horses. Emma watched him from the doorway, her hair loose around her shoulders, her heart strangely light. For the first time in years, she felt as though her life wasn't something happening after pain. It was simply life, real and ongoing, carrying her forward. She stepped out to join him, the grass cool beneath her feet. He looked up when he heard her coming. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "I don't mind," she replied. "It's better waking to you than nightmares." He chuckled softly. "I'll try to keep the nightmares away then." She leaned against the fence, the morning sun warming her face. "Do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" Luke glanced at her, squinting against the light. "No. I think we just didn't stop walking until we did." The truth of it settled between them like the gentle weight of a blanket. They stood side by side, watching the sun rise higher, their shoulders brushing, their breaths falling into the same rhythm. The world was still wild, still uncertain, but they had found a small corner of it that belonged to them. Days later, Luke found an old photograph in one of Wade's boxes, a faded picture of Emma as a younger woman, laughing under a willow tree. He showed it to her, and she smiled softly, tracing her own face with her fingertip. "I remember that day," she said. "We thought happiness had to be loud." "And now?" he asked. "Now I know it can whisper." She slipped the photograph into the pocket of his shirt and left it there. That night they walked together under the starlight, the wind carrying the sweet smell of drying hay and cedar. Luke's hand found hers, their fingers fitting together easily, like two halves that had waited years to be whole. The sky stretched wide above them, endless and kind. The world had broken them once, but here, beneath the silver light of the moon, they had learned how to mend. Not perfectly, but honestly. Not quickly, but fully. The ranch glowed softly in the distance, a single lamp burning in the window like a heartbeat against the dark. And for the first time since either of them could remember, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something worth waking up for. The final days of autumn came like a sigh across the valley, soft and golden. The air turned cooler, the wind carrying the scent of pine and rain from the distant ridges. Morning light slid through the kitchen window, spilling over the wooden table where Emma set down 2 cups of coffee. Luke's hands were rough, marked by years of labor and war, yet when he reached for the cup she offered, his touch was gentle, deliberate, as if the smallest act between them carried its own quiet holiness. Outside, the fields shimmered beneath the fading sun. The corn had been harvested, the horses grazed lazily along the fence line, and the sound of the forge echoed faintly in the crisp air. The world was preparing to rest, and so were they. It had been months since the night of gunfire, months since the fear that once hung over them like a curse. The ghosts still lingered in memory, but not to haunt. They simply reminded, whispering that healing had been earned, not given. Emma's laughter came easily now, like water running over stones. She had learned to live in quiet moments, the hum of wind in the rafters, the crackle of fire, the steady rhythm of Luke's boots, crossing the floor. She no longer flinched at the creak of the door, nor woke gasping from nightmares. Her soul, once splintered by loss, had begun to knit itself together in the soft, unspoken way that love allows. Luke watched her from across the table, sunlight resting in her hair. He couldn't remember when she had stopped being the stranger at his gate and become the reason he looked forward to the day. Every morning now began with her voice. Every evening ended with her near enough to touch. The loneliness that had once hollowed him out was gone, replaced by something he couldn't name but felt in every breath, the simple grace of belonging. When she looked up and caught his gaze, she smiled. "You're staring again," he chuckled. "Just reminding myself this is real." She shook her head gently, her eyes warm. "It's as real as the sunrise. You just had to live long enough to see it." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. The warmth between their hands said everything. Later that morning, they walked the ridge together. The land spread before them like a vast breathing sea of gold and rust. The wind played in Emma's hair, tugging loose strands that danced against her face. Luke carried his hat in one hand, letting the breeze cool the sweat along his temples. They didn't speak much. The silence between them had grown sacred, filled with trust instead of fear. Halfway down the trail, they stopped where Wade's grave stood, a simple stone under a lone juniper tree. Emma knelt to place a handful of wildflowers at its base. The petals trembled under the touch of the wind. "He'd be glad it ended this way," she whispered. Luke stood behind her, his hat pressed against his chest. "He'd be proud of you." She turned slightly, her eyes soft but steady. "You think so?" "I know so." For a long moment they stood there together, the sky wide and endless above them. The world didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt tender, fragile, alive, the way it does when forgiveness has finally taken root. As they walked back toward the ranch, the clouds began to gather, brushing the hills in shadow. Rain came in the late afternoon, sudden and cleansing, filling the troughs, running off the roof in silver streams. They worked side by side to cover the hay, laughing as the rain drenched their hair and clothes. When the thunder rolled, Luke pulled her close beneath the porch, his arms wrapping around her like a promise. She leaned into him, her laughter fading into quiet, the sound of her heartbeat sinking with the steady rhythm of the rain. "This feels like forever," she said softly. He kissed her forehead. "It is, if we let it be." When evening fell, the rain eased to a mist. The cabin glowed with firelight, warm and golden against the grey. Emma sat curled on the rug by the hearth, her dress drying in the heat, while Luke strummed the old guitar that had hung untouched above the mantel for years. The melody was slow, deep, aching in the way that beauty sometimes aches when it finally returns. She closed her eyes, listening. The notes drifted through the room like the hum of memory, like a prayer answered without words. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked when the last chord faded. "My brother," Luke said quietly. "He used to play during the war. Said it made the fire sound less lonely." "Then keep playing," she said. "This place doesn't know what loneliness is anymore." He smiled, setting the guitar aside. The room fell back into silence. But it was a good kind of silence, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket. When night came fully, the world outside turned silver beneath the moon. Luke and Emma sat on the porch again, the smell of wet cedar rising from the ground. The stars looked close enough to touch. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the slow, steady thrum of his heart. "You ever wonder what comes next?" she asked. Luke looked out across the valley. "Tomorrow," he said, "and the day after that. And everyone after, until we can't count any more." She smiled. "That sounds like a plan." He turned to her then, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Her breath caught, and she nodded. Together. The night wind moved gently through the fields, whispering around them like a hymn. In that moment, nothing else existed. No gold, no fear, no ghosts, only the living warmth of two people who had finally learned to stop surviving and start living. Weeks passed, and the world kept turning. Winter crept slowly over the mesa, frosting the edges of the earth. But inside the cabin there was always light. The fire burned steady, the sound of laughter filled the air, and even the silences felt alive. Emma began writing letters again, ones she never sent, addressed to the life she thought she'd lost. She kept them in a small box by the window, next to the carved dove Luke had made. He didn't ask to read them, he only watched her write, and in her eyes he saw something whole. He had learned that healing doesn't come like thunder. It comes like dawn, quiet and slow, breaking across the heart until you almost don't notice when the light returns. And in that light, he'd found her. One evening, when snow had just begun to fall, Emma stood by the window, watching the flakes drift down. Luke came up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Cold?" he murmured. She shook her head, leaning back against him. "No, I've never been warmer." He kissed her hair, breathing her in, the smell of smoke and lavender clinging to her skin. "You belong here, you know." She turned to face him, her smile soft as candlelight. "So do you." They stayed like that for a long while, the snow thickening outside, the fire whispering low inside. When he finally lifted her chin and kissed her, it was the kind of kiss that makes time stop, the kind that doesn't promise forever but lives as if it already has it. Later, when the fire burned low and their hands found each other again beneath the quiet, the world outside felt miles away. All that mattered was the rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of skin against skin, the unspoken truth that love, real love, doesn't need to be loud to change everything. It just needs to stay. And it stayed. Through winter's frost, through spring's thaw, through every sunrise that found them tangled in the soft light of morning, the pain that had once defined them no longer ruled them. It had become part of their story, something that shaped but did not destroy. Years later, the locals would still talk about the widow who ran through the dark and the quiet rancher who took her in. They'd say the land healed them both, that the two souls found peace where the storms once lived. And sometimes, at dusk, travelers passing through would swear they saw a woman in a white shawl standing by the gate, her laughter carried on the wind, her eyes bright as the morning star. If you've walked through your own storms, if you've known loss, fear, or the kind of loneliness that carves deep, let this story remind you. Healing is not a single moment. It's a journey of small mercies. It's in the way the light returns, in the way hearts learn to open again, in the way love quietly stays when everything else has gone. And if this story touched something in you tonight, take a breath, hold it close, and share it forward. Leave a little kindness in the world before you go. Tap that heart, leave a comment, or subscribe so we can keep walking through these stories together. Sometimes all we need is a voice, a story, a reminder that love still survives, quietly, faithfully, endlessly.